Hey everybody, we're going to go over the FRQ that I posted earlier this week, take a look at the scoring guidelines and then a couple student examples to see if you would score them or not. Just a quick reminder, the exam this year, the AP exam, is only 2 questions, 2 FRQs. And that's why for the next couple weeks, we're going to work exclusively on practicing FRQ skills. All right, so here's another quick look at the setups. Just 2 questions. The first one's going to be a little bit longer than the second one. One will be concept based, and then one will be research based. So this one's it's a little bit of both. So we took a look at this the other day. We've got a psychologist doing some research at her home during trick or treat. She's kind of looking at a couple different independent variables. Number 1, are the kids in a group or are they alone? And number 2, is she making them take off their masks or is she allowing them to leave their masks on? And then she wants to see how much candy they're going to take from a bowl that's sitting outside. Okay, so and then we've got our results down here. If you notice, interpreting a graph is absolutely going to show up because we already know one of the questions is a research-based question. So being able to interpret a graph is going to be on the part of the exam this year for sure. So if we look here, what percentage of the kids took additional candy? And then we've got our independent variables down here on the bottom. The removed mask took less than the kept mask on. And then also the children in groups took more candy than the children who were alone. So removed mask, alone kids took the least. Mask on, group kids took the most. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. We've got 4 points we're going to look at here. What's the dependent variable? What happened with the hypothesis? Why can we not generalize the researchers' findings? And then why is it not a naturalistic observation? So here we go. And this question was from last year's exam. So these scoring guidelines are straight out of, this was the question I actually graded last year in Florida. So what's the DV here? Remember the independent variable, I, is the if part of the hypothesis, and then the dependent variable depends on that. It's what we're measuring in the end. So in this case, what was the researcher looking for? We wanted to see how much candy was a given kid taking from the bowl outside, right? And that depends on, in this case, whether or not they were wearing a mask, whether or not they were in a group. So we're looking for something about taking the additional candy. And you even see a pretty simple score here from Jordan. The operational definition is the experiment. RF, now Jordan, your verbiage there is a little shaky, but that's all right in psych. If the children took more pieces of candy when the psychologist went back into the house. So that scores for sure. That's definitely the dependent variable. And it can be that simple. Some of us might want to add in a little bit of a definition. Dependent variable is what we're measuring. In this case, the psychologist was looking for whether or not the child took the candy. There were some really good responses here from you all. The key there is just remember getting the IV and DV straight. Number 2, does data support the hypothesis? So we're going to take a look at it here in a second, and we can even skip ahead a little bit, look at the underlined section here. What was the hypothesis? This psychologist thought that children would take more candy when they were alone, and they would take more candy when they were masked. Okay, so did that happen? They did take more when they were masked, but they did not take more when they were alone. So any type of variation on that would work. This is a response from Christian. The data does not support the psychologist's hypothesis that children would take more candy if they were alone. We saw that they took more in groups. And then secondly, the data does support the hypothesis that children would take more candy if they were masked. We saw that there was a pretty significant difference between masked and unmasked. So if you look at the scoring guidelines here, Christian hit both of those parts, and he would definitely score that point. Okay, number 3, generalizability. There's a sampling problem here because the researcher only used kids that came to her house. She did not randomly sample her population, which is a problem, especially in experiments. So you can't generalize the findings because the researcher only used the kids that came to her house. So a sample response from Whitney. The psychologist cannot generalize her findings to all children because she only conducted the experiment on and with the children that came to her home. So she wouldn't know how much additional candy a child would take if they were at a different house or in a different neighborhood. Does this neighborhood have kids that are like particularly thieving or like greedy or have a sweet tooth or whatever it is? Or does this neighborhood have children whose dads are all dentists and they won't let them eat candy? Or so, you never know until you have a random sample. Okay, good. So you see the example up here. Anything about sampling bias or not random sampling would definitely score there. But you could say something as easy as it's not representative of all children. Something like that would work. And then point 4, why is this not a naturalistic observation? Super straightforward. This is an experiment because the researcher forced kids to take off their masks. As soon as you put your hands on and tell people to do something as a researcher, it is no longer descriptive research like an observation. It's an experiment. It's hands-on. We spent a lot of time on that at the beginning of the year. I know it's a long time ago, but just remember that hands-on, hands-off. This will definitely come up. Like, what research method is this? Will absolutely be on the exam. So here's a sample student response. A naturalistic observation is when a psychologist studies something or someone in its natural environment. They do not change or modify anything about the environment. They just simply observe it. Blah, blah, blah. And then you got the playground example. So this experiment is not a naturalistic observation because the psychologist is manipulating variables and altering outcomes. And then even more specifically, you could say they force them to take off their mask. But this is a great response either way. Point 5, modeling. Modeling, that's Bandura, that's Bobo doll, right? So we do what we see. Sample response from Kabar. When kids were alone, they chose the amount of candy for themselves, but in groups that seen one kid pick one piece of candy, so the other was likely to do the same. You're mimicking or modeling behavior, right? So good response from Kabar, that would score. Number 6, pre-conventional morality. So this was that unit that we did after school was canceled there. Moral development is how do we know the difference between right and wrong? Pre-conventional is the first stage of morality when we are just trying to avoid being punished or trying to get a reward. So it's kind of self-centered, egocentric view on what's right and wrong. Time out! Major exam tip right here. Okay, so AP has come out and said pretty clearly that you can use your textbook. They know this is an open note exam, which is crazy. The time limit is going to kind of make it tough to look things up, but not impossible. Here's one thing that I would recommend using. It's just Quizlet. So let's say that the FRQ that we were working on a second ago, we're here and you get to they're asking you about pre-conventional morality on this FRQ, and you're like, oh, I got no idea what pre-conventional morality is. I would have Quizlet up and open before you start your exam, right? So you're getting set up. It's 1:30 on exam day. Exam starts at 2. Get this up in a window, and then type it in. If that's the one thing you don't know on the FRQ, type in pre-conventional morality right here. It says punishment and obedience orientation. Moral thinking often tied to punishment. So if I'm going to tie it back into this question about the Halloween candy, so maybe kids don't take candy because they're afraid to get punished. Point. Because you looked it up really quickly. Okay. They said you can even throw in definitions from a textbook. So this is just a really quick way here on Quizlet to look up terms that you don't know. Now there's not going to be enough time to look up 8 terms, so you got to be studying as well. But if there's 1 or 2 you don't know, or if you need just a little bit of extra help, I think this could be like a nice little crutch you could use as you're taking the exam. So Robbie C, super straightforward and simple. By the kids knowing right and wrong and knowing they was wrong for taking more candy, so they didn't take more candy, I would assume, right? That would score. And then here's an example from my notes from that unit. Pre-conventional that's a little kid morality, how they see right and wrong in the world. And it's just, all right, if I do this, I'm going to get spanked or not, right? It's all about them. It's not about law or society or even trying to impress other people. It's about trying to avoid punishment for myself. And then last point 7, for the frontal lobes. We know the frontal lobes contain decision-making, personality. That's you, right? So we said it's right here. Imagine that window right there in your forehead. That's looking at the world and making decisions. So Jaja B said frontal lobes is, even though there's two of them, so frontal lobes are the home of our personality. So some children could have good, respectful personalities and take one piece of candy. Other children can have bad and disrespectful personalities and disobey orders and take multiple pieces. Cool. That's an easy point. Okay. So to see how you did there, hopefully you did well. I'm going to post another FRQ here in a minute and continue practicing and get paid. Like this should be a great opportunity to get paid.